And that made a great trip because we learned so much history about the 3rd Armored Division.
Right.
And I learned quite a bit when I was young, sitting on his lap. I learned an awful lot more, as time went on.
Yeah. Now, I remember you showed me this picture. Is your dad in?
Not in that picture. I always thought that was one of the best pictures that ever came out of World War II because it's right before the Normandy invasion, right before the paratroopers were dropped off. That's when Eisenhower went there, and it's very impromptu. He just got there and said, guys, let's talk about it.
Yeah.
And he said it was one of the more casual. He said he just fit in with the troops so well.
Mm-hmm.
And I could see him. I mean, I never met the gentleman, although my unit was sort of responsible for when he was buried up in Kansas after he passed away. We was there for Riley, were sent up there for the burial.
Right.
But that was given to me during that time frame, and I always hung on to it as something that was very important. He was quite the character, quite the man.
I forget what it was. I remember when I was 8 or 9 years old, he was coming to San Antonio for some reason. I don't know whether it was during an election year, whether it was it would have been before. I don't think he was. Maybe it was when he was president. Maybe he was coming there to campaign for Nixon when Nixon. I forgot what it was. But I remember my father drove me. We were in Austin. My father drove me to San Antonio real quick so that I could see him drive by.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
Yeah, that was one of those I saw one day. I'm not a collector. Anything I see is part military. I want to pick it up and take it with me.
Yeah.
I also, like I say, I had to picking up stuff that was in the paper, and I'd cut them out. My dad and my mom got very good at cutting stuff out, and so there's tons of articles there. Probably are not much to anybody but to me. This gentleman here was quite a character. You might want to borrow this and read it. It won't have anything to do with what we're doing, but Sergeant Poole, he ended up being one of the most decorated soldiers in the 3rd Armored, and he was twice recommended for Medal of Honor. And there's a good storyline behind there. Yeah, there's my dad with him there. I was in a retirement home and all that.
Right.
But these were just some other pictures of my dad when we were down in Fort Polk here.
And this is when they were honoring him.
Yeah, that's when they were actually honoring the 49th Armored Division. Had gone down during when we had the Cuban crisis. The 49th, my dad was battalion commander, and so when they were down there, they just went back for some ceremony 50 years later and made a dedication down there, and he happened to be the guest of honor.
And when was this?
That was probably about 10 years ago.
And your dad's passed away.
He has passed away about 2 or 3 years ago. Yeah. About 3 years ago in her son. And, but pretty striped unit down there. Those guys were training early every morning and training late in the evenings. And Dad suggested I might want to get out there and train with them a little bit, go running with them. I said, sir, I'll put that behind me.
And I've got any more pictures of you?
Yes, sir. I got them booked over there. I brought you this. This is a gift to you. A young lady that I told you who's a Cambodian refugee, came home to the States, got her PhD. She's doing a little teaching now over at Blaine College, and this is her first of a second book. She's getting ready to start a second book here shortly.
Yeah.
This pretty much brings you from the early years of Cambodia, pretty much up to about 1974, 75, when the U.S. pulled out and the Khmer Rouge started their killing over there, killing fields.
Right.
And her parents were political people there in the country before they either were left or were killed. She lost a brother over there in the killing fields, also a sister. And she got a lot of her information from people here at A&M, the colonel stuff, but also I sat down with her on 3 or 4 or 5 occasions and provided the information, which she was kind enough to give me recognition in the book, and also referred to my name in the book several places on stuff that I knew about that had to do with Cambodia.
Yeah.
You know, let me see here, go this way real quick. Picture of her, there I am right there. That's the road leading from Con Tin up to the river that goes into Cambodia.
Uh-huh.
And what they did is you have fire support bases. You bring in artillery, either 3 or 6 batteries, 3 or 6 tubes. And you surround it with a dirt perimeter, and you bring in infantry, like myself, to guard it. 2 nights before we got there, they got hit. Several guys had gotten killed, and they killed about 20 or 30 NVA. So we came in there and pulled security up until the day we actually flew back into Cambodia and started our fighting over there.
Yeah.
And that's that picture. I was also the security, the intelligence officer for our battalion, and these were after action reports. Some guy in our unit had done this drawing, and I had it, and I made it available to her, and she got a release to put it in the book.
Wow.
And that's a picture of the young lady herself.
Now, where is she now?
She's here teaching over at Glen.
Yeah.
Talks to Rotary clubs and Lions clubs.
And she teaches, what does she teach?
She teaches, believe it or not, I think she teaches chemistry. The biology or chemistry, I forgot which one of the two. I think it's chemistry. But
and this is the lady that you were telling me about, right?
Her English is good, but it's difficult to understand her. I find myself leaning into her when she's talking. And so I don't know how she'd be if you ever did a show with her, but she, might be one of those things that you might want to do at some future time, but then again, may not. But I do know she's given several talks to a couple of the Lions and the JCs around here, both promoting what's going on, about Cambodia, but also promoting the book as well.
So she grew up. And she teaches history?
No, chemistry or, I think it's chemistry or biology.
Oh, science professor, yeah. Now you grew up in Temple, is that right?
Grew up in Temple. We were living on a farm up north of Temple, up close to the community of Pendleton. But they didn't have a school district there, so I actually went to Troy School from grades 5th through the 9th grade.
Right.
Well, my dad was called up for the Cuban crisis. My mom said, I'm not living on a farm by myself, and I raised 3 kids. And he said, okay, so he moved us into Temple. And we lived in Temple. That's only 3, 4, 5 miles south. We lived in Temple as younger kids. Moved out to the farm with my grandfather, out with the ranch. And then we moved back into Temple and school district, and also in the city. I actually moved off when he went for about a year with the 29th.
Right.
That was pretty serious times, and that was one of the things I tried to explain to this class over here the other day. I said, you folks don't understand. They asked one, we asked why we were in Cambodia. And I said, well, I'll keep hearing every time we go into another country, it has to do with oil. I said, rest assured, Viet Nam had no oil. I said, we were there to stop communism. And I said, back when I was a kid coming up during the 40s, the baby boomer growth, the word cancer scared us to death. It was like a cancer. I said, we had, communist China and communist Russia, and we had the Cubans right down here below us, Central America, Che Guevara, starting to turn those countries against us. I said, so we had a country in the South Pacific say, hey, we want you to help us stop communism. We jumped at it.
Right.
And I said, even though Eisenhower had his opportunity to go in there and assist the French in the late 50s, all we did was provide airplanes to, use for supply runs, but we never provided men or monies. I said, it wasn't until Kennedy in the early 60s that we truly started to send special forces over there. But even that was in a limited capacity. But as our special forces needed more and more support, then Johnson got in there after Kennedy got assassinated and just threw the whole country behind, let's save South Vietnam from the communists. And truly believed that's what we were there for.
Right.
And so then after Johnson realized after 3 or 4 or 5 years, and we had over 500,000, 600,000, 700,000 men in there, that we were never going to win that war. And that's when he didn't run for re-election again. And Nixon got in there, and he ran on the platform, I'll pull our troops back. In fact, the year I came back in 1970 with the 25th Infantry, I think we got back over 150,000 men in just 1 year. So Nixon's got some bad, rapport naturally because of the Watergate and all that. But, to the soldiers, he got us out of a war that we weren't going to win.
Right.
And another question these kids asked me, I thought was, what does it take to win a war? In fact, I posed that question then. They came back and I said, well, what is that? what does it take to win a war? And you go back to the time.
Just right now, want to know that.
They want to know that. And the big thing I say, the big question that's why we didn't win Vietnam. Number one is that typically you take terrain. You take a city, you take a hill, you take a mountain, and you keep it. And I said, we didn't do that over there. If you go back and look at what Hal Moore did with the first Cav in Hai Drang Valley in '65, he sat there with 450 men and defeated 2,000 MDA. And then what did they do? They put him out there for 5 or 6 days, and over a month or two later, they're fighting that same battle, that same mountain. You go back to the movie Hamburger Hill. Go 101st Airborne, spent a week trying to take this one mountain, hundreds of casualties. Took it. The NVA suffered tremendously. Well, they pulled them off the mountain. 3 or 4 months later, taking the same mountain. After a while, you realize you're not there to take terrain. It's attrition. Who's going to want to quit first? And naturally, after we saw 10 years of this and lost a number of soldiers, they won. And that's what the saddest part. I had troops out there. By the time I got over, the hardcore soldiers were already back in the States. Back in the beginning of the war in 65, 66, 67, which is really the time period they fought the big battles. You had the 101st over there, the 82nd Airborne, Big Red One. They came over as whole units. They had trained in the States together. They trained in Germany together. They went over as a group. They knew each other on either side.
Yeah.
And they couldn't win it. When we got over there, we had primarily kids being drafted. We had 90-day wonders, lieutenants who went through the Durham program there, and 90 days after they started, went through their officer training, they had those shiny bars on their shoulder. So they're going through the ROTC program, the West Point. And we got into a situation where, hey, if we're not going to war, why are we still here? And now as a lieutenant, we had to sit there and explain to those men, you're not out here wasting your lives away. We have a purpose. Well, Lieutenant explained that purpose to us. Well, they taught us how to fight a war. They prepared us for that. As lieutenants, we had a lot of other mental preparations, but we didn't have the kind of the captains who had experience and maturity, the majors and colonels with the experience and that maturity. We were just lieutenants. We were trying to survive. We were trying to make a good showing so that if we wanted rank further on, we didn't mess up so badly here that we couldn't gain those upper rank. So the explanations were, we're giving the South Vietnamese a chance to build their armies strong enough to where when we pull out, they can defend this country themselves.
Right.
We're stabilizing the country. Okay. Well, how come it's taking us 10 years to do it? Well, I said, in every situation, it's not an overnight thing. Something like this does take a while. And plus, the trouble with Vietnam is their government kept changing. I mean, how many times did they change the government in 10 years that we were there? It had to be at least 3 or 4 or 5 different presidents.
Right.
And each one came in with a different system of how he was going to make it work. And so really, in essence, is getting the American soldier to go out to the field to fight. Not to be a challenge, but it really wasn't easy. Now, I understand that when I was over there, and some of the articles I read later, there were American troops that sometimes said, we're not going to follow this lieutenant or this captain because we can't see a purpose behind it. I think that was totally blown out of proportion. I think that happened maybe 1 or 2 instances. And I think it wasn't so much the order given to go on the field. I think it was the person who was given that order wasn't competent, and they didn't want to go out and fit back in the field with him. I think that's what it boiled down to. But we were over there, and I was in class the other day, and I said, I know it's a junior level class, but most of y'all are either 17, going to be 18 real soon, or some of y'all are 18. I said, back when I was in Vietnam, y'all be fighting over there right now if you weren't in school. And I said, I never had a problem with any of the young soldiers over there. If I gave them my order, they would do it, and they'd do it fast because they knew it was survival. They knew I had a purpose, and they knew they had a purpose. If we all worked together, our chances of surviving and accomplishing our mission was going to be more successful.
Right.
And I still believe this day that if we've been turned loose and allowed to go into Cambodia, which was a neutral country, but the other side didn't recognize a neutral country. If we've been allowed to go into Laos, which was supposed to be a neutral country, but the other side didn't recognize. If we'd gone across the DMZ, if we put pressure on them, then the whole outcome would have been entirely different. But we weren't ever allowed to. And even when we did go in Cambodia in April to May of 1970, we were only allowed to go in 18 to 20 miles. So they got the word we were coming across. They knew we were coming. So they backed up 22 miles. So in essence, all we hit, the serious things were large cats.
So you came, you were at A&M. When did you finish at A&M?
I graduated, my class was class 68, but I didn't graduate till January of 70, or December 69.
So you started out at A&M and then went to Vietnam, or?
Well, it was.
What was the chronology there?
Well, it's strange. I always knew I was going to come to A&M. I always knew I was going to be in the Corps and the Army.
Mm-hmm.
But I couldn't come in my freshman sophomore year. I couldn't afford, third generation. I couldn't afford to come in my freshman sophomore year. My brother was already here. So I didn't think I was ever going to be able to get in the Corps at A&M. But between my sophomore and junior year, A&M developed what was called a 2-year program.
Yeah.
You could just serve 2 years in the Corps and still come out with be an officer. Mm-hmm. But you were required to do one extra basic camp. Mm-hmm. So between my sophomore and junior year, I went to Fort Knox, Kentucky, which was just typical boot camp. Mm-hmm. There was no specialties, no silver platter. If you made it through boot camp, fine. If you didn't, they cared less. Yeah. And I was pretty successful at that camp. Came in to A&M as a junior in the Corps, mm-hmm. but I had freshman privileges, which meant I had instead of wearing a white belt, I wore the black belt. Right. During the SMU game, I had to wear the spurs just like the freshmen did, and I accepted it. Having my brother at A&M, having my dad and grandpa, I knew what was expecting me at A&M, and I played the part and did it well. Right. Then between my junior and senior year, I had to go to the normal summer camp, which was that year was held up at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. It was very successful up there. I think I was first or second in my battalion. Came back here, and I was made a platoon leader in my company here at A&M. Well, because of my grades, which weren't the best in the world, but because of my accomplishments at both summer camps, I was given the DMS, Distinguished Military Student, mm-hmm. and then I graduated as Distinguished Military Graduate. Mm-hmm. Well, that allowed me a very special thing. I could choose which branch of service to go into. And branch of service being like armored, artillery, or infantry, which are the combats. Or I could go on transportation, quartermaster, which was service. You had to put one combat, and the rest service, and being a distinguished military graduate, I could have probably gotten anything I wanted. But my dad expected an awful lot of us boys, and I knew I expected a lot of myself, so I put on infantry, armored, and artillery. I wanted to go combat. Right. And I got infantry. So off to Fort Benning, Georgia I went. Uh-huh. And that's called Infantry Officer Basic. That's where you spend about 9 weeks of them teaching you how to be a real officer in the U.S. Army. Uh-huh. This was school training here. This was real training down there. Uh-huh. So as I completed that course, and before I got my assignment to my next station, a couple of the guys in the unit suggested we won't go to jump school and Ranger school. Well, knowing that I was going to go to Vietnam, I said Ranger school would be a good insurance policy. So I opted to go to Ranger school, then Airborne, and then I was assigned Fort Riley, Kansas. You had to do a time with a in-country unit before they send you to Vietnam. Mm-hmm. So I spent 3 months at Fort Riley, Kansas, and then from there I was shipped over to Vietnam.
Yeah. So you were in country what day?
Got in country probably the first week in January, mm-hmm. and left out there probably about the second or third week in December. A normal tour of duty is supposed to be 365 days, mm-hmm. but because of the 25th Infantry being pulled out, mm-hmm. because at the very end I had less than 30 days left, mm-hmm. then I was allowed to derouse or to go ahead and.
And this was 1970.
In 1970. So I was there from January 70 to the middle of December 70.
Middle of December, and you were a ground soldier. You were Army infantry.
I was Army infantry, combat soldier, and platoon leader.
Right.
And I was that for 9 months. Now, when we first got over in country, the rotation up at that point had been that a platoon leader was be in the field for 3 to 4 to 5 months. Mm-hmm. There were so many officers that the Army wanted to rotate through to give them that experience. And this is one of the other things I think the reason why we were in Vietnam. We were training mm-hmm. our young officer corps to get ready for the, quote, bigger war that we might have someday with Russia or China. Right. So we were trying to train as many officers. So this was maybe one of the problems I saw down at the platoon level, is that the platoon was seeing a changeover of maybe 2, 3, or 4 officers, platoon leaders, during their 365 days. Yeah. So you might get a guy in from West Point who naturally was doing it his way. Right. You'd get one in from the Citadel. You might get one in from Arkansas, or you might get one from A&M. So each officer wanted to do it his way to make his reputation. Right. And so those poor soldiers down in the NCO ranks down to private had to suffer through each officer and say, my God, what is this one going to bring to us? Yeah. And so I was real impressed with the way they were able to adapt and to change. Right. But When I got over there, I thought at the time I was going to be out in the field 3, 4, 5 months. But then they stopped sending American troops over there.
Right.
And the ones they sent were on a limited basis. So my term out in the field ended up being 9 or 10 months.
Yeah.
And I had no problem with that. In fact, in my 11th month, when the 25th Infantry was being pulled out, and everybody that had less than 11 months, they were already shipped back to the States. I still had a little over a month, so they sent me over to the 1st Cavalry unit. 1st Cav was stationed at that time north of Saigon, and the 25th had been over west. So I was working the same area, jungle type, smaller mountain types, rice paddies, villages. When I got over there, I had to do 1 week in-country school. Every infantry division, air mobile division had their own way of conducting operations. So I had to go through their 1 week introduction school. It just so happened that my ranger partner from Ranger School, who had not been the Corps Commander at University of Houston, was the officer in charge of the in-country school. So for a whole week, I would sit there in class, taking notes, learning how they were doing it. Even he and I would sit down and have a drink, and he would discuss their operations. Got down to my last day to where I was going to be out, they were going to give me orders, and with less than a month left, I was getting ready to go back out in the field and be an infantry officer again. He said, "Brewster, you don't have to do this. Stay here and teach with me." You teach with me. I said, "I appreciate the offer," but I said, getting up in front of people, it's more scary to me than going out there and facing booby traps and a V-suit. And I was very truthful about that.
Wow.
And since then, though, I have come back. I have taught at Glenn College for a number of years. I have gone over to the NM. I'm a guest lecturer over there in the Ag Economics Department on occasions. Jump at every opportunity to talk to Lions, JC Clubs. So it's something that I finally worked myself out of. But back then, though, I was willing to go back out in the field for another month, just to keep from standing up in front of people and talk to them.
That's interesting.
But luck would have it, and the whole Vietnam thing with me was either a guardian angel on my shoulder or luck. And there were so many instances when I was over there to prove that there's a guardian angel on my shoulder. I'm the luckiest person in the world. Because just when I was supposed to get orders to go out in the field, they rescinded them and said, "You don't have enough time to go out in the field. You'll only be there for 3 weeks, 4 weeks. You can't get adapted that fast. You're more of a decrement than you are going to be an asset." They sent me, they want you back at the 25th. Well, I thought the 25th had pulled out. Only to find out that everybody had pulled out except for the commanding general and the staff and a few hundred men still holding the Cu Chi, which was the main headquarters, 25th. So I went back there, and as soon as I got off the plane, there was a lieutenant waiting for me. He says, "The chief of staff wants to talk to you," who's a full colonel. And I said, "Well, this doesn't ever sound good when chief of staff wants to talk to a lowly lieutenant." So I walked in his office, and he had my report, my folder out in front of him, and he was coming through there and said, "Ranger School, Airborne School, you received these medals, da da da." "Yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir." So "You're exactly what we're looking for. We need an officer to take the division colors back to Hawaii." I said, "Wow." I said, "You sure?" He said, "Yes." And so for the next 2 weeks, I brought in all the regimental colors. See, all the regimental colors wasn't right there 25th. 25th is made up of 3 brigades. But we use the term regiments too, regimental colors. And some of the 25th had fought up north in the I Corps at the very beginning of the war. So we had to go up there and bring some of the regimental colors back, so that we marched in Hawaii at Schofield, we brought the colors back, we'd have each of the division colors with us, or regimental colors. So I got to fly around Vietnam with a helicopter, pick up these colors, fly it back. Then I was training the troops. We had a group of about 30 to 35 young men, almost platoon size, because platoon's 44. And I was out there responsible for them. I made sure they had medical records, they had all their leave records available to them. They had clean uniforms. I was their mother hen for 30 days, marching them every morning, marching them every evening, and then load them up. And I would say 4 or 5 of those young men happened to be Medal of Honor winners too. And they were getting an opportunity to show off what they did when they got back. So we flew back into Schofield, Hawaii, Schofield Barracks. There was a band waiting for us, and that was one of the saddest things about Vietnam, is that World War II, Korea, when the units came back, they came back together. Or when they came back, they had a chance to disseminate, to acclimate before they got back into society. You could be out in the field in Vietnam, watching your fellow men getting killed, you're doing the killing, and 4 or 5 days later, you could be sitting in the bar back at home out of the Army, and you're supposed to act natural. And it's hard to act natural when you do something like that. But I came back to a band waiting for me, because I brought the colors back. I was in Hawaii for 4 or 5 days while we did the ceremonies and the transfer of colors, and I was treated with royalty. That didn't happen to a lot of the soldiers. So I was, I had a easy time of it compared to a lot of them.
Talk about
the 11 months, the times that you talked about how lucky you were. I remember you told me last time that we talked about one decision you had to make about whether to go into a creek bed or a jungle.
That was
And you made the right decision. It turns out. Talk about the 11 months.
11 months started off that I got on a helicopter after my 1 week of in-country schooling.
This is Bravo Brazos Valley, brought to you by Meese and Associates, and I'm Tom Turbiville. Veterans of the Brazos Valley come from most every conflict of our country's military history, including Vietnam. For Lieutenant Joe Brewster, military history is a family affair. He was a platoon leader in Vietnam and Cambodia, survived through intense combat while many of his fellow soldiers did not. Joe Brewster is an Aggie and a mighty proud one, and that's a family thing, too. His grandfather and great-uncle were Aggies. His father and uncle were Aggies. Joe and his brother are Aggies. And you guessed it, Joe has 2 sons who are fourth-generation Aggies now.
There was 2 things I was assured of. Number one is I was going to graduate from Texas A&M University, and number 2 is I was going to be a soldier. And where most kids growing up would get on their dad's lap and be told stories, fairy tales, and make-believe stories, ours was always stories about World War II. And entirely different from most kids is that he would sit there and tell us the honest truth of what it was like being in the military and fighting in a war to end all wars.
Joe Brewster grew up in Temple. His dad, Olin Finley Brewster, was retired military, a hero, a real hero of the Battle of the Bulge.
Probably one of the most written about majors of World War II. In fact, in one battle during the very beginning phases of the Battle of the Bulge, he had 6 tanks and 1 company of infantry, 1 company of airborne at a roadblock called Parker's Crossing. And for 2 days, he held off a whole Panzer division, giving the Americans a chance to regroup behind him before he was able to pull out. Now, he wasn't able to pull any of his vehicles or his tanks out. I think most of them were either destroyed, either by the Germans or he himself destroyed on his way out. But he was able to pull all his men out.
We'll have more right after this.
Meese and Associates Attorneys at Law invite you to come watch Texas history come alive at the Brazos Valley Museum. Warrior Cultures, Comanche War Parties versus Texas Rangers is on display right now at the Brazos Valley Museum at the Brazos Center. The exhibit takes a non-biased view of the struggle for control of land and other rights of the period. Rare examples of weaponry, dress, and culture have been brought together from 5 different museums and a dozen private collections. Meese and Associates say, don't miss Warrior Cultures, Comanche War Parties versus Texas Rangers, right now at the Brazos Valley Museum.
Joe Brewster went to A&M his last 2 years of college, but entered school as a third-year ROTC guy. Here's how that worked.
And A&M came up with this new program. It was a 2-year program where you could do your first 2 years of regular college somewhere else, and then you could transfer in as a junior in ROTC. Now, before you could go to another college and transfer in as a frog and do all 4 years ROTC, but this allowed me to come in as a full junior in ROTC program. What I had to do, though, was to attend a boot camp. It was a 9-week boot camp at Fort Knox, Kentucky. One of those things that I knew a lot about the military, but I knew right off the bat that I was going to have a difficult time because when we started doing marches and stuff like that, I had not been in a band before, nor had I attended any kind of military school. And so I was pulled off to the side and given special instructions on even how to march.
But he was a quick learner.
By the end of camp, I ended up being number 1 in my company, and that carried over into where I got to A&M. I had to suffer through, but it was an enjoyable time frame of being a junior in the Corps, but having freshman privileges.
This was the 70s, and Joe Brewster knew where he was headed.
I ended up going to Vietnam.
There was no desk job waiting. Joe Brewster was there, in the jungle, Army infantry. His survival skills from Ranger School training served him and his troops well.
After about 5 days of constant fighting, all the officers in my company, except for myself, were either wounded or killed.
Talking about his Vietnam experience did not come easy to Joe Brewster, and he still talks in measured tones, but he's proud of his service, as we are proud of his service. You'll hear more about it tomorrow. I'm Tom Turbiville for Meese and Associates. This is Bravo Brazos Valley. This is Bravo Brazos Valley, brought to you by Meese and Associates, and I'm Tom Turbiville. When I first talked to Joe Brewster about this series, he wanted to make it clear that he was not interested in this being a brag session on him. After all, there were thousands and thousands who served our country in Vietnam. He was one who returned to tell the story. More than 58,000 did not return. Joe Brewster was Army infantry, and part of his training was Ranger School, which he credits for his survival.
I always heard that you go with days with only about 1 or 2 hours of rest, and you would go with about 1 meal per day, which you had to share with your ranger partner. So they tried to just see how far they could push you. And I heard stories of people, seeing images at night or talking to trees and whatnot. I used to laugh about that, but on one particular patrol, when I was a point man going up one of the steep mountains, I got attacked, what I thought at the time was a dinosaur. And throwing down my weapon, took off running back down the mountain, hollering there was a dinosaur after me, only to find out later it was nothing more than an old grouse who was protecting his covey of babies and everything, and it had jumped up and frightened me. I was very blessed that not only was I ranger qualified and trained, but I had a platoon sergeant that also had gone through the ranger program. So between the two of us, we managed to get through a whole year with minimum casualties to our unit, where other units were suffering fairly high casualty rates.
Joe Brewster was 25th Infantry.
During my time in Vietnam, I served as an infantry platoon leader. Typically, you'd have about 44 men in a platoon, but due to normal attrition and injuries and wounds and whatnot, we were doing good to have 25 to 30 troops out in the field at any one time.
Surviving Vietnam was a crapshoot, especially for those who fought deep in the jungle, as did Joe Brewster. There were plenty of close calls where, for whatever reason, he was chosen to survive while others were not. He recalls one of those times.
On our last day of being out in the field, I was given instructions to go set up ambush positions in one particular area of our area of operation. And as we set off with 18 men that evening, I had a choice to make, either going into this jungle area and set up an ambush, or going out into this other area along the creek bottom where I felt like the infiltration of troops might be the best for ambushing.
Joe Brewster chose the creek bed.
With no activity that night, we choppered out the next morning to another area. That afternoon, to my understanding, a ranger unit of about 8-10 men came into the exact same area. Instead of going out into the center area where I ambushed that night, they turned into the west and went into the jungle area and hit a full NVA regiment of close to 400 or 500 men. They were virtually wiped out, and it took 4 to 5 days of additional troops to actually eliminate that threat. I keep thinking back to what if I had that night decided to go into the jungle instead of going into this alternative area, what would have happened to us? This unit had seen us, there was no doubt about it, but they were trying to move silently from the Cambodia area down closer to Saigon without being detected. And so therefore they were not going to engage us unless we just happened to walk right into their camp. So that's the reason why we were spared that day, and where the Ranger unit was not.
It was Joe Brewster's honor to return his unit's colors to the United States after his service was done. He'll talk about that tomorrow. I'm Tom Turbiville for Meese & Associates. This is Bravo Brazos Valley. This is Bravo Brazos Valley, brought to you by Meese & Associates, and I'm Tom Turbiville. We conclude our visit with Joe Brewster of the Brazos Valley. Joe's a real estate appraiser in town, which must seem 100 years and millions of miles from where he was in the early 70s, a platoon leader hunting the jungles of Vietnam. Like any Vietnam vet, his story cannot be told in just 12 minutes of radio time. As he looks back at his service, today it almost seems surreal that he was ever there.
I often wonder if that was really me that was over there. Now that I look back, that seems like just an entirely different life that I had. It's one I'm extremely proud of. It's not one that I have spoken with to lots of people, because when we first came out of Vietnam, it was the feeling of not failure as a soldier, that we didn't win the battles that we went into the fight. It was the failure of not winning the war when we had every opportunity, or in our mind we felt like we had every opportunity to win it. And a lot of people did not want to talk about Vietnam back in the 70s or 80s. It was not popular, but now it seems like a lot more people show interest in it. They ask questions.
Joe Brewster had to win another battle of sorts in later life. He told you Wednesday that his dad, Olin Finley Brewster, was a veteran of World War II. A highly decorated colonel at the Battle of the Bulge. Young Joe Brewster, the Vietnam veteran, longed to talk soldier to soldier to his father about their wartime experiences, but that was difficult for his dad. Joe did not understand at first.
My dad, as I said, used to tell us stories of World War II, and I grew up fighting German tanks. But when I got back to Vietnam, other than maybe one time when he, in generalization, said, "What was it? What was it like?" But within 3 to 4 or 5 minutes, I knew he really, truly wasn't listening to me. I was extremely hurt. And because most of your people who have ever been in combat, it's very difficult to talk with others who have not. And I felt like this was something that I could share with him. And it wasn't until years later that I was told by both my brother and sister that the reason why he never talked to me about Vietnam was that he always felt guilty that I would have to go over there when he thought that he had fought the war that's supposed to have ended all wars. And that when I was over there the whole time, his concerns were so great that he felt guilty ever realizing that one of his kids would have to fight another war. After hearing that, I guess it was pretty easy to absolve the anger I had for him, or for him never sitting down and talking to me, father to son or soldier to soldier.
We'll have more after this.
Meese and Associates Attorneys at Law invite you to come watch Texas history come alive at the Brazos Valley Museum. Warrior Cultures, Comanche War Parties versus Texas Rangers is on display right now at the Brazos Valley Museum at the Brazos Center. The exhibit takes a non-biased view of the struggle for control of land and other rights of the period. Rare examples of weaponry, dress, and culture have been brought together from 5 different museums and a dozen private collections. Meese and Associates say, don't miss Warrior Cultures, Comanche War Parties versus Texas Rangers, right now at the Brazos Valley Museum.
Joe Brewster's Vietnam experience came to an end, as did his military service. But there at the end, he wondered what was going on. He was called to meet the colonel of his unit. Was he in trouble?
With total fear and deprivation, I did attend a meeting with him, and at that point he announced that I had been selected to be the officer in charge of bringing the division colors from Vietnam back to Schofield Barracks in Hawaii, which was quite a privilege. Arrived back in Hawaii in December and went through all the formations and the receiving the colors. Came back to the States, realizing that probably a career in the Army wasn't what I really wanted. I went ahead and got out of the service, came back to A&M, did graduate school, and then been working as an appraiser ever since.
Joe Brewster, Vietnam vet of the Brazos Valley, we salute your service. I'm Tom Turbiville. For Meese and Associates, this is Bravo Brazos Valley.